Hello, my name is Kristen and this is Kristen Craves Books. Today I thought we'd talk about my most anticipated releases of March, and there are actually 22 books on this list, which obviously I won't get to them all, but I just wanted to bring them to your attention because a lot of them sound really fantastic, and I know it can be difficult to find what's coming out in a certain month, so hopefully some of these are new to you. So starting with March 2nd, we have what might just be my most anticipated book of the year, and that is Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, who wrote probably my favorite book of all time, Never Let Me Go. And this is the first from him in a long, long time. I think since he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, this is his first book since then. And this follows Clara, who is actually something called an artificial friend, which means she's an AI of some kind, and she's in a store watching customers come in and out of the store, and she's hoping that she's purchased, that somebody recognizes her, and she's studying everybody's behaviors, and she's just very observant. So that intrigues me. There's something kind of eerie about that, and I'm really looking forward to that because what Ishiguro does with sci-fi is really, really compelling and gets you thinking about some moral and ethical questions and what's too much. Is AIs, their morality there? Do they have humanity? That was a big part of Never Let Me Go. So I just love the questions that he poses in his books. Really looking forward to Clara and the Sun. Then we have Infinite Country by Patricia Engel, and this is one that has already been getting a lot of buzz, and I know that it follows Mauro and Alina and from their childhood onwards, and it talks about deportation, immigration, being separated from your family. I think it goes back and follows previous generations and their experiences with that. I think it follows Elena's mother, so I think this book is going to have a lot of impact and a lot to say in a book that is only 200 pages. I've heard it's really powerful, so looking forward to that one. Next one coming out March 2nd is one I've already talked about a few times on this channel, and that is Accidentally Engaged by Farah Heron. And this is a fake dating, or in this case, a fake engagement romance between Rita and Nadim. And they pretend to be engaged in order to enter a couple's cooking contest. So I think that setup sounds adorable. I love any romance or any book in general that's centered on food or baking, and I know that bread is a big part of this story as well, so I'm really looking forward to that one. I think it sounds really sweet, and I've been seeing some great early reviews. Again, another one for March 2nd is Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner, and this one is set in two timelines. In the 1700s, we're following a female apothecary who is giving poison to women who are seeking revenge on men. And then we jump to a present-day timeline where we're following a woman who's dealing with her grief, and she finds an apothecary bottle washed up on shore, and she realizes that it's connected to these unsolved apothecary murders. And I think that leads her on a journey. So I'm excited to see the perspectives of both these women and how that all plays out. Next up, we actually have a true crime. It's also coming out March 2nd, and that is Babysitter, My Summer with a Serial Killer by Lisa Rodman. And this actually follows a serial killer I've never heard of. His name was Tony Costa. And Lisa Rodman realizes decades after he is arrested that he was actually her babysitter as a child, someone that her mother trusted her with, that she thought was kind and understanding man. And she's reflecting on this time in her life, and she remembers him taking her to what he called his secret garden, which is actually the place where a lot of the bodies of his victims were found. So that's really creepy, and this really haunts her, and she has to talk about this. She starts getting deeply involved in the case and researching. So this is her story, and I think it's part true crime, part memoir. Looking forward to that. It's not often that I highly anticipate a thriller. I'm pretty picky when it comes to thrillers, and I like to hear what everybody else has to say before I read them. But when I heard the premise for Every Last Fear by Alex Finley, I knew that this was one I had to read. And this follows the Pine family, who are all found dead by an apparent gas leak. But their son, who was away at university, and I think his name is Matt, doesn't believe this, and his brother has been in prison for killing his girlfriend. And a famous viral documentary came out proving that Danny, his brother, or claiming that Danny, his brother, was innocent. So a lot of people believe that he's innocent, but I think Matt saw something back then that makes him not so sure. So I think maybe he's suspicious that Danny's involved in the death of his family. I'm not sure, but that premise sounds really interesting, especially with how into we all get into true crime documentaries, things like Making a Murderer, The Staircase, things like that. So I think having that in this book sounds really interesting. That's it for March 2nd. So now we're on March 9th. And the first one is one I know so many of us are highly anticipating. I cannot wait for this. It is Act Your Age by Eve Brown. Again, I've talked about this so many times. I love Talia Hibbert. And this is the third book in the Brown series, and we obviously follow Eve, who's a bit more clumsy of a character, and her parents are saying, you need to grow up, you need to put yourself out there. So she applies for a chef job at a B&B, and she doesn't get the job, but as she's leaving, she somehow accidentally runs over the owner with her car, and he breaks his arm. And he reluctantly hires her because he's now short-staffed and he can't do everything himself with a broken arm. And obviously there's like a hate to love romance that happens here. And like I said, I like anything to do with cooking, so the fact that she is a chef is just a bonus for me. And then we have a historical fiction that is a World War II fiction, which I'm also picky about, but this one sounds really intriguing, and I've heard great things about the author's work, and that is The Rose Code by Kate Quinn. And this takes place at Bletchley Park during World War II, which I knew nothing about, but it was apparently a mansion where a lot of code breakers at this time lived, and it was very secretive. So we're following 3 women who are working there and their relationship with one another and their unlikely friendships. So I'm just really curious about that. I like World War II fiction when it's told from a perspective I haven't read from before, and this is definitely the case here. And then on March 9th, we have a true crime. It's called Last Call, a true story of love, lust, and murder in queer New York. It's by Elon Green. And this is about a serial killer who was killing gay men in New York in the 80s and 90s. And I've heard that a lot of this book focuses on the victims, which does not happen a lot in true crime, but I think we're moving more towards that way of thinking and giving victims a voice. So I love that about this. And I think a lot of this book focuses on how these murders were not talked about in the media. The media at this time was focusing on the AIDS epidemic. So there was no light shone on these victims at that time. So here we are years later, and Elon Green is giving them a voice, which I think is amazing. Next we have one that I have an e-arc of that I've been getting through slowly because it's a bit dense, but it's really fascinating, and that is The Codebreaker, Jennifer Doudna, Gene Editing and the Future of the Human Race by Walter Isaacson. And he wrote that huge Steve Jobs biography, so it's that author. And I didn't know much about Jennifer Doudna going into this, or CRISPR, which is the gene editing program that she helped create. And this is a very timely book. There's already a few mentions of coronavirus in here, and we're touching on some of the ethical and moral dilemmas of gene editing. There's lots of history on how we discovered the gene, how we discovered DNA, and the DNA sequences. So that's fascinating. I'm not science-minded at all, so some of this is going over my head, but I'm really into it, and I think it's very accessible. So I do think a lot of people will learn a lot from that one, and I'm enjoying it. And then we have Sweet and Bitter Magic by Adrienne Tooley, and this is a YA fantasy novel, and it follows 2 girls, one who's a witch who is incapable of love, so she has to steal those feelings from others, and the other one is what is known as a source, and she's taking care of her ailing father. So these 2 come up with some kind of deal, and I think they fall in love throughout the course of the novel, so that sounds brilliant. Been really into fantasy lately, cannot wait for that one. Next is one I actually have an ALC of thanks to Libro FM. And if you follow my blog, you will have seen this book on my most anticipated nonfiction of 2021. And that is Women and Other Monsters, Building a New Mythology by Jess Zimmerman. And this is a collection of essays that analyze 11 monsters in mythology, including Medusa, and somehow relates that back to feminism. I think this is also part memoir. I've been hearing some great things about it, so looking forward to that. Now we're on to March 16th, and the first one I have is actually a YA anthology, and it's called That Way Madness Lies, Shakespeare's Most Notable Work Reimagined, and that is edited by Dahlia Adler. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a series of short stories that are each retellings of Shakespeare's most notable work. And there's a lot of authors I love contributing to this, including Anna Marie McLemore and Mark Oshiro. So looking forward to that. I like these YA anthologies that have been happening over the last few years. There was one about Edgar Allan Poe that I really liked. I forget what it's called, but I'll insert the cover here. One of my favorite anthologies so far, I think. So looking forward to this one. And then speaking of Anne Marie McLemore, we have their newest book, which is The Mirror Season. And Wild Beauty is one of my favorite books, but I haven't read anything more from them. This one sounds like it's going to be heartbreaking, and I couldn't sum it up, so I just want to read you the synopsis. It says, Graciela Crystal's whole world changes after she and a boy she barely knows are assaulted at the same party. She loses her gift for making enchanted pan dulce. Neighborhood trees vanish overnight, while mirrored glass appears, bringing reckless magic with it. And Seela is haunted by what happened to her and what happened to the boy whose name she never learned. But when the boy, Locke, shows up at Seela's school, he has no memory of that night and no clue that a single piece of mirrored glass is taking his life apart. Seela decides to help him, which means hiding the truth about that night, because Seela knows who assaulted her and him, and she knows that her survival and his depend on no one finding out what really happened. So that sounds like sounds like a really difficult topic, but I trust Anne Marie McLemore with it. So these references to glass I'm really intrigued by. The synopsis doesn't give much away, so I'm curious to see how this all plays out. And the last one for March 16th is one that I've had on my TBR since it was announced, and that is Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulet. And this book is actually set in Canada, and again, Libre.fm sent me an ALC, so I'm thrilled about that. And this follows Donis, who is torn between two worlds, her Ojibwe side and her French-Canadian side, and she doesn't feel like she belongs in either. And then one day she witnesses a tragedy and somehow becomes an FBI informant, and that's really all I know about it, but I've been hearing a lot of fantastic things. On March 23rd, the first one is one I've already read and I've talked about many times, but I want to bring it up again, and that is Bruised by Tanya Matheju, which is a sweet romance, but really it's a coming-of-age story. There's lots of character development in here, lots of working through grief, finding who you really are, what makes you happy, accepting love from others. So our main character has lost both her parents, and there's a lot of references to self-harm. There's self-harm in here, so if those are triggers for you, this might be a difficult book to read. And she discovers the roller derby, and she wants the pain that comes from the roller derby, but she doesn't expect the team that comes around with that. Doesn't expect the friendships that evolve and the romantic relationship that will come from that. It's really a hopeful story in the end, and really sweet. There's some great side characters in here, so I highly recommend that one, and I can't wait for everybody to read it. And the next one is actually newer to me. I've been seeing some reviews of it lately, and since I've been getting into fantasy, this one really caught my eye. And it's The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke. And this is actually the start of a new fantasy series. And in this one, we're following Toraine, who was kidnapped when she was a baby, and I think this is a common practice in this book. And she is being sent to where she was born in order to stop a rebellion. So now her loyalty is being tested, and I think she becomes a princess assistant, and they fall in love. So that's something I really want to read. The last book that comes out March 23rd that I cannot wait for, and I cannot believe that we're already getting another book from Aidan Thomas, and that is Lost in the Neverwoods. And I'm somebody who loves Peter Pan retellings. I actually love retellings more than I love the source material, more than I love just this plain story of Peter Pan. I've read some really fantastic retellings, and Cemetery Boys was one of my favorite books of 2020. I cannot wait to see what Aidan Thomas does with this story. And I think this one actually follows Wendy, and her brothers have been missing for 5 years. And then in her town, more children are going missing, and she somehow runs into or meets Peter Pan in the woods, and they team up to find these boys. So I'm definitely intrigued. I like the mystery element in that one. Finally, we have March 30th. Lots of books coming out this month. So the first one I have is of Women in Salt by Gabriel Garcia. And this is actually a historical fiction that focuses on a mother and daughter relationship. And that is something that I always love. That is all I know about it. But even just the cover alone intrigues me. I'm going to leave a good read link to all these books so you can read more about them. Next one is one I actually have an arc of, and that is the revival of Opal and Neve by Donnie Walton. And this one is being compared to Daisy Jones and the Six because it follows a fictional musical group and is told through a series of interviews, which you can see here. And really, that's all I need to know about it. I'm so excited. I've heard fantastic things about this already, and it's a huge priority. I think I might start March off with this book. Next is Wild Women and the Blues by Denny S. Bryce, and this is actually set in the 20s, which is my favorite time period to read about if I'm reading historical fiction. And I think, again, which is really common, there's two timelines. The second one is set in 2015 and is following a girl who's researching the showgirl from the first timeline in 1925. So I love when there's that connection through the timelines. I'm really intrigued to see where this goes. And I will never say no to a book set in the 20s. And the last book on my list is actually one I've talked about quite a few times on here because I love the cover, I love the premise, that they have high hopes for this. And that is Sweet Hand by N.J. Peltier. And this is a romance. It's a hate-to-love romance between two characters who his best friend is marrying her sister. So I think it takes place over the course of a wedding weekend, which I always love a romance set at a wedding. And obviously they have to spend a lot of time together. And I think they fall in love. I'm sure there's great banter. And I'm excited to see how that plays out. And I'm excited to finally read this one because my gut is telling me I'm really going to love it. So that is it. That is all the books that I am looking forward to in March. I would love if I could actually read these all, but I won't read 22 books in March. I would love to get to all these at least by the end of the year because there's not a one on here that I don't want to read. I think they all sound fantastic and I don't even know which ones to prioritize. But I will definitely be getting to Actor A.G. Brown because, come on, it's the third book in the Brown Sisters series. I've been waiting for that for ages. Lost in the Neverwoods because I know that I love Cemetery Boys and I love a Peter Pan retelling. And Claire and the Sun because Kazuo Ishiguro wrote my favorite book of all time. But if I got to some of the others, I'd be thrilled. So I'd love to know what book you're most looking forward to in March. If I missed one, please leave it in the comments below because I'm adding books to my most anticipated shelf on Goodreads all the time. I think it's at 210 books at this point. And as always, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Bye for now.